This is Thomas Wayne Riley, and you have found yourself in the American Southwest. This is the 7th episode in the series over the Civil War in the American Southwest. This episode is graciously sponsored by one of my new favorite companies, the Buffalo Wool Co. Y'all know I have great love and respect for America's national mammal, the bison. My very first episode was over the wild and woolly beast, so when I tell you I discovered a company that makes 100% bison wool products 100% in America, you know how excited I got. The Buffalo Wool Co. makes the most incredible and comfortable socks you've ever worn. Not only are the Buffalo Wool Co. socks comfortable, but they are warm. You can wear them in the house, to bed, or on a hike. I wore mine in the sands of Great Sand Dunes National Park, and I've worn my Buffalo Wool Co. socks while hunting in the northern forests of Wisconsin. I plan on wearing them for the rest of my life. Buffalo Wool Co. 100% guarantees you will love the product or your money back. The owners of Buffalo Wool Co. have been raising bison in North Texas for almost 30 years, and they're even more passionate about the amazing animals than I am. Buffalo Wool Co. not only makes socks, but also knit caps, gloves, scarves, and extremely warm and comfortable clothing for kids. My wife and I have a little one on the way, and I will absolutely be keeping our kids snug and warm with the Buffalo Wool Co.'s expanding brand. If you like being comfortable and warm and looking awesome while doing it, and if you support 100% made in America clothing, by people who are passionate about these animals and the ranchers who raise them, you will love the Buffalo Wool Co. Head over to their website, thebuffalowoolco.com, or my website, theamericansouthwest.com, where there will be a link on the home page. That's thebuffalowoolco.com. According to historian Robert May, the Southern dream of empire, denied it by the North, helped fuel the drive for secession in 1860. Author Donald Frazier from his Blood and Treasure, Confederate Empire in the Southwest. While Sibley and his brigades were marching north in the cold snow towards their hollow victory at Val Verde, back at Mesilla, Baylor had been left to defend the Confederate capital of Arizona. He wasn't thrilled at this prospect, and he felt slighted, but he immediately attempted to make the most of it. He had the loyalty of his men that were still with him, but he also had the loyalty of the Arizona Guards, those men who had been defending Pinos Altos and the southern Arizona Territory since Baylor's arrival. Mostly they'd been fighting Apaches, but now Sibley and Baylor had grander designs, especially for a man named Captain Sherod Hunter. Even before Sibley's departure, Hunter had been raising a new company that was called Company A. It would later be known as Baylor's Arizona Regiment. The Mesilla Times would call it a, quote, crack company of the service, end quote. Baylor and Hunter had been hunting for the hardiest of men for the company, men with frontier experience, men who had no qualms killing Indian or Yankee. Hunter was from Tennessee, but he had, for a while, been in the Mimbres River Valley at the now ghost town of Maury City. This place ain't too far from Pinos Altos and Mimbres, about 20 miles north of modern-day Deming and 10 miles north of the City of Rocks State Park. His homestead along the Mimbres River had come under constant attack by Apaches throughout the years. He sent many a letter to Fort Fillmore and the U.S. Army asking for assistance, but he never got a reply. Once the war broke out, Hunter had gone to Mesilla and had enlisted into the Arizona Rangers, which became the Confederate Arizona Guards. Since December, he had been raising his own company. Many of his men had come from the aforementioned Coopwood's San Elizario spy company, but many others were from Baylor's 2nd Texas Mounted Rifles. One of his main men was a man named Lieutenant James Tevis. Tevis had actually fought with William Walker in Nicaragua. That exciting filibuster adventure that I mentioned in the 2nd episode of this series. Another of his trusty men was Lieutenant Jack Swilling, who played a role in the capture of Mangus Coloradus in the Apache series. Hunter's company consisted of relatively older men, with the average age being 28, which is pretty old for a soldier, but these men were veterans, and Baylor would count on these men to further the expansion of the Confederate Empire in the Southwest. By the time Sibley had been ready for his assault, Hunter had raised a sufficient amount of men to be able to march north with the general for the planned attack of Fort Craig. But Hunter and his company wouldn't make it all the way to the fort or the battle. Along the way, the aforementioned head of the 4th, James Riley, he had returned from his trip to Chihuahua, and he had intercepted Sibley at Fort Thorne during the cold march from Mesilla. Riley had come with both good and bad news in regards to the Mexicans. Colonel Riley told Sibley that the governor of Chihuahua, a Governor Luis Terrazas, had received him, treated him well, and had informed him that the governor, quote-unquote, did not think he would permit the Yankees' passage through his territory. Not exactly reassuring words, but it was something. The really good news was that Governor Terrazas had become the first official government body to recognize the government of the Confederate States of America in the entire world. The bad news, well, the Rebs could buy horses, food, and supplies from the state of Chihuahua, but not too much, since the governor thought it would cause inflation in his territory. The other bad news was that in no way could the rebels pursue fleeing Apaches into Chihuahua unless it was in quote-unquote hot pursuit. But Riley assured Sibley that it was no matter. The Confederates would do it anyways, since there had been historical precedent for just such a thing in the past. After Sibley had heard this news, he thanked Riley for his adventure, and then sent him on another one. This time, he was to go to the governor of Sonora. Riley's main mission this time was to establish a Confederate port at Guaymas, and Guaymas is about 333 miles straight south of Tucson. Once there, the rebels could import supplies and export cotton. This was exactly what Baylor had wanted. With Sibley's blessing, the empire was sure to grow. To accompany Riley, as far as Tucson at least, was Captain Hunter and his 60 men of A Company, the Arizona Guards. They all left Fort Thorne on February 6th. This was 10 days before Sibley's arrival to Fort Craig and the ensuing battle at Val Verde. Hunter's mission from both Baylor and Sibley was to set up a bastion of Confederate support at Tucson, raise the rebel flag there, and reopen the lines of communication between Mesilla and Southern California. There was still hopes that SoCal would secede. Oh, and all the while, hunt down the Mexican banditos and Apache warriors plaguing those beleaguered peoples of southern Arizona. Frazier, in his Blood and Treasure, Confederate Empire in the Southwest, wrote that, quote, with his Sonoran schemes receiving diplomatic sanction, Baylor's dream and ambitions seemed resurrected. Men loyal to him would accompany Riley every mile of the journey. In addition, because of Mexican diplomatic attitudes concerning hot pursuit of Apaches, Baylor finally had a chance to act upon a long-cherished desire. He would take the field again, leading the Arizona Guards in a pursuit to the death of the hated Apaches. End quote. Sibley hadn't known this at the time, but Baylor had been recruiting even more men from Texas during this entire winter of 1862. And with those hopeful reinforcements, that would never materialize, by the way, plus the 400 men of the 7th Texas at Fort Bliss to his south, which would not join him, Baylor hoped to expand the Confederate Empire with he in command. But the rebel empire was about to reach its zenith in the American Southwest. Out in the west, Captain Hunter and Colonel Riley, with about 75 Confederates, including Lieutenant Tevis and Lieutenant Swilling, They all arrived at Tucson on February 28th. They were cold and weary after a harsh and frigid 2-week march, but they were ready to resume their missions. Once in the town, they raised the Confederate flag over the dilapidated pueblo, and apparently, the old Indian fighter, who would later participate in the Camp Grant massacre, Bill Ory, would dance a jig. Captain Hunter would write, quote, "My timely arrival with my command was hailed by a majority, I may say by the entire population of the town of Tucson." End quote. The spirits of Tucson were high. Hunter and Riley then had the citizens recite the oath to the Confederacy, and those that refused were escorted out of town and their belongings were confiscated. Riley then went south towards Old Mexico to expand the Confederate Empire in the southwest. Once settled, Captain Hunter sent out word to the O'odham, or the Pima, and the Maricopa Indians to see if they'd like to side with the Confederacy for the planned march on California. He also began to send out small units to the further west to gather intel, because word on the desert air was that a storm was brewing. A strong force of Californians may be planning to head east to confront the rebels and to retake the territories. By February, Baylor was no longer happy to be sitting in Mesilla on his hands. He wanted battle, fortune, and glory, and he had high hopes. So high, in fact, that he wrote his wife and told her that she and their many kids would within a few months be living in the governor's residence in Mesilla. In the capital, Baylor still enjoyed a lot of support from his soldiers. He even had his own private military secret service that was ran by a fiery Irish spy named John Phillips. He employed a number of gamblers and shady types from Mesilla and Santa Fe. These Secret Service men were keeping track of all the goings-on in the territory. And eventually, they would uncover one of those spy rings I mentioned a few episodes back that plagued Baylor. Another of Baylor's trusted Mesilla men, a man named James McGuffin, he volunteered himself as well as two of his Isleta Puebloan, quote-unquote, workers, to infiltrate Canby's Union lines and send back word of their movements. One of the Texas men at Mesilla was quite interested with the Puebloans, and he would write, quote, "They are from an old and partially civilized tribe who up to within a few years ago kept a fire burning in their temple. They claim to be the only true descendants of Montezuma's tribe. They are as far advanced in the arts almost as we are." End quote. It was many of these men's first interaction with non-nomadic Western Indian tribes. Bored and restless, Baylor and Mesilla decided to find some action. So in late February of 1862, Baylor, with more than 100 of his loyal men, decided to pursue some pesky Chiricahua raiders. Raiders who had recently been steadily attacking farms, ranch settlements, wagon trains, and Confederate Army camps in the territory. He had heard that after the attacks, they had fled to Chihuahua, Mexico. Baylor would be in hot pursuit. First, he and his men rode to Pinos Altos, but were soon off towards the south, riding deep down into Chihuahua. At mountain after mountain, they found evidence of the Apaches, but then were told that they were actually 50 miles north, just across the international line in Confederate Arizona. Frustrated, they rode hard again and prepared to attack the rancheria at sunrise. But, in typical fashion, the Apaches had seen them coming, and in the dead of night, they headed south, slipping around Baylor and his men. Undaunted, Baylor and his men raced after the Apaches and cornered them in the small mining town of Caretas. There, the rebels, deep into Mexico, against the wishes of Governor Terrazas, began a heated exchange of gunfire. Ultimately, many of the Apaches would be killed before they fled into the mountains. Satisfied, Baylor and his 100 men then rode back north to Mesilla. Now, amazingly, in 2 of the books I read, they both portray this engagement with the Apaches in a completely different way in a completely different town in Chihuahua. They both present their stories, the same story, as 100% fact, when in reality, it is a fabrication. I'll summarize Megan Kate Nelson's telling, but again, this is not how it went down. In her telling, she writes that the Confederates rode to Corralitos, not Caretas, and there, in Corralitos, the soldiers made a mess of things. They entered homes, trashed corrals, and harassed the people in their pursuit of the renegade Apaches. And then, Baylor found 3 Apaches at the house of a prominent miner. The 3 Apaches were 2 women and a man. The Mexicans pleaded with Baylor, saying that these were his slaves, sold to him by Comanches, and that they had been baptized and were Christians. These were not the raiders he was looking for. Baylor remained unfazed, though, and in this retelling, he dragged the 3 out into the street where he executed the man and one of the women with his pistol. He then yelled to the gathered residents, quote, "If you continue to harbor Apaches, we will return and raid Corralitos again." End quote. That story, while painting the rebels in a horrible light, which is the purpose of both books that quote this story as factual, while it is an interesting story, it is false, a myth. They made it up. Baylor was a violent man, but when I read that story, it seemed unreal to me. But I bought it until I read the alternate version and then did some research. Author Jerry Thompson wrote for the Texas State Historical Society, and he said of this raid, quote, "Preoccupied with the hostile Apaches of the region, Baylor led a raid deep into the mountains of Chihuahua and supposedly killed a large number of Apaches, although no official correspondence exists to prove this." End quote. When researching the validity of this very raid, I actually came across a book review on JSTOR. JSTOR gives out 100 free articles or books a month. But JSTOR had a book review that was written by this very same Jerry Thompson I just quoted from. Except he wrote this book review 7 years before writing for the Texas State Historical Society. He wrote the book review in 2013. He was reviewing a book titled Turmoil on the Rio Grande, The Territorial History of the Mesilla Valley 1846 to 1865, by a very good author named William S. Kaiser. In that review, Jerry Thompson actually states that the book brushes over this very same Corralitos raid and doesn't mention it during its discussion of Baylor. Thompson, in the review, writes, quote, "Surprisingly, there is no mention of Colonel Baylor's controversial Corralitos raid deep into the mountains of Chihuahua in pursuit of the Apache." End quote. So between the years 2013 and 2020, even historian and author Jerry Thompson had changed his tune on the validity of this raid into Chihuahua. And I would eventually stop using 2 of my original sources because they just continually quoted as scripture untrue stories. But regardless of the details of the pursuit of the Apaches, this raid would have disastrous international effects. The previously amenable Governor Terrazas immediately wrote to Sibley that, quote, "The unwelcome and vituperative behavior of Colonel Baylor and all the forces of his command," end quote, were an insult to the Mexican nation. Terrazas also said that if Baylor or any Confederate entered his territory again, they would be arrested. Now again, Sibley never got this letter, and it sat at Fort Bliss until after the war, so yet again, the validity of this letter itself is in question. But still, Terrazas and the Mexicans were mad, and the United States consul in Mazatlan, Mexico, wrote of the incident and said, quote, "The Texans are becoming daily more hateful to the Mexicans. The atrocities of Baylor's men will not be overlooked, but will serve to revive the hatred of the Chihuahuans to the Texans." End quote. In just one ill-advised raid, that it turns out may not have even happened the way some historians claim, in this one raid, Baylor had begun to undo all the work he and Sibley had done in building the Confederate Empire in the West. And make no mistake, the Union government would use this incident to spread fear into the hearts of Mexicans who had previously wanted to join the Confederacy. although the coming Emperor of Mexico in the Civil War against Juarez would complicate the whole plot further. And really, because of events on the horizon, this may be the last time I even mention Mexico and its importance to the Confederacy. Baylor and his forces made it back up to Mesilla, but by mid-March, he was restless again. Then he got word from his Arizona Rangers at Pinos Altos that Mangus Coloradus was wanted to come in and sign a treaty. My War to the Knife episode over Mangus covers this whole saga. This was actually when Baylor wrote his infamous Kill Them All letter. What he wrote was, quote, "Use all means to persuade the Apaches or any tribe to come in for the purpose of making peace, and when you get them together, kill all the grown Indians and take the children prisoners and sell them to defray the expense of killing the adult Indians. Buy whiskey and such other goods as may be necessary for the Indians, and I will order vouchers given to cover the amount expended. Leave nothing undone to ensure success, and have a sufficient number of men around to allow no Indian to escape." End quote. When President of the CSA, Jefferson Davis, got wind of this command, he was infuriated. But it wasn't just the command that Baylor gave which made the president angry. It was the postscript that Baylor had attached to the command that so detested Jeff Davis. At the bottom of that command, Baylor had wrote, falsely, quote, "The Congress of the Confederate States has passed a law declaring extermination to all hostile Indians." End quote. This was absolutely untrue. And in fact, as Fraser writes, quote, "The rebel government was dedicated to the old U.S. policy of pacification and had never passed any such law." End quote. Jefferson Davis, upon learning of this deceit, would immediately revoke Baylor's governorship and strip him of his rank of colonel. This was an affront to civilization, according to Jeff Davis, who, while not a big fan of the Indians himself, he did not want this kind of wanton violence and degradation done against them, especially by his subjects. And lying to accomplish this goal, out of the question. The order demoting and stripping Baylor of his rank and title would not reach the Texan while he was in Arizona, though. By the end of March of 1862, Baylor was already on his way home to North Texas after resigning his governorship himself. He was ultimately heading for Richmond, and once there, he would beg President Davis for more troops and supplies in the West before heading back to Texas and reorganizing another army. He would never again step foot in New Mexico or Confederate Arizona for the remainder of the war. He would soon be elected by Texas to the Second Confederate States Congress, where he would serve from 1863 to 1865. And I will mention Baylor again in the last episode, the 11th episode. After the war, when Baylor learned that Sibley had sat out at the Battle of Val Verde on account of his drunkenness, Baylor would call Sibley a, quote, "infamous coward and a disgrace to the Confederate States." End quote. But Baylor, towards the end of his career in the territory, hadn't exactly represented the Confederate States well either. The Battle of Val Verde, although spectacular, had been far from decisive, and Sibley's command, although victorious, had suffered a crippling blow to its mobility. That was Fraser again, and he couldn't have summed up the battle and the ensuing hardships of the Confederates better. After the battle, the rebel army was in rough shape. Once they had decided to go north instead of engage again with the Union forces, the bulk of the army only made it 6 miles north of Val Verde. Many of their animals were dead. Their wagons were broken or had few animals to pull them. The cannons, even the ones they had won, the Val Verde guns, they were in rough shape. The companies had been fragmented by death and injury. They were running low on food. It was cold. So they had won, but it had come at a high cost. Davidson, whom I had quoted from quite a bit already, he would remark as they marched north that, quote, "Our mules are about worked down and can hardly pull the wagons. The consequence is the boys have to put their shoulders to the wheels and roll the wagons along. The beeves, like the mules, are so poor they can hardly walk. The truth is, The marches show as much or more heroism than the battles." End quote. Little did Davidson know their marches just begun. But temporary relief was on its way. While the men on horseback trotted ahead, they encountered a Union wagon train that had fled Canby and Fort Craig. The wagons contained hundreds of pounds of wheat, salt, and sugar. There were also Federal uniforms to warm the men and a whole flock of sheep to provide some meat. And actually, those Federal uniforms, they will wear them into the next battle. In A.B. Petticolas's journal, which I own, he wrote, quote, "The wearing apparel was divided out to the different regiments and companies, and we had dinner and breakfast of mutton." End quote. Davidson, after this treasure had been found, remarked that the men were in much better spirits and they could be heard to, quote, "crack their jokes and sing as merrily as we did when in Texas." End quote. After the find, the men on horseback of the 5th Texas Mounted Volunteers, along with what artillery pieces could still roll, they continued on further up ahead to the town of Socorro, which is about 40 miles north of Fort Craig on the Rio Grande. But along the way, McNeil and his soldiers of the 5th ran into a Colonel Nicholas Pino and 200 of his New Mexico volunteers, and they were ready for a fight. I will let Frazier sum up the small skirmish that ensued. After exchanging shots, the rebel commander deployed his cavalrymen around Socorro and demanded its surrender. When Pino refused, the Texan guns opened fire around sunset from a rise southwest of town. After a few rounds bounced off the adobe buildings of the town and ricocheted down its dusty streets, the demoralized native troops, reluctant Unionists at best, scattered. Pino, hoping in vain for reinforcements and with only a handful of his own troops staying by the colors, reluctantly surrendered the town just after midnight. End quote. Yet again, the Confederates found much-needed supplies, including much better weapons, especially those who still had lances. They'd witnessed Lang's bold and suicidal charge, and they wanted no further part in it. Captain Jerome McCown would gladly exchange his lance, which he called, quote, "perfectly useless in this peculiar kind of warfare." End quote. They found Springfield rifles, Mississippi rifles, and a few Sharps carbines. Plus, they found thousands of pounds of flour and 300 Federal horses and mules. By February 26th, the rest of Sibley's army had caught up to the small city of Socorro, where they were finally able to rest. Some of them got to sleep indoors, and they got to set up the sick and injured in a hospital. But more tough decisions were going to have to be made, starting with the lack of animals and mounts for the quote-unquote mounted infantry. These weren't cavalry who fought on horses, mind you. They were like the dragoons of old that would ride their horse to the battle, dismount, and then fight on foot. Most of the mounted infantry's rides had been killed at Valverde after they had tied them to the cottonwoods behind the battle lines, only for the Union to blast most of them with their cannons. I spared y'all the stories that soldiers wrote about the thousands of crying and dying animals missing limbs that they found after the battle. It was harrowing stuff. So Sibley had to remount as many of his soldiers as he could. He asked every single soldier to turn in their hungry and depleted horses and mules so that they could be redistributed. Petticolas wrote that at first, this didn't seem like a problem since they were in such bad shape already, but eventually the men would come to resent this order. He wrote, quote, "The idea of surrendering their mounts is not as repugnant to them as one would naturally suppose it would be to the cowboy of Texas." And he would continue, "When this was completed, it placed us once more on a new footing, and we were ourselves again. All gloom and despondency was banished from our camp." End quote. But eventually the realization of walking set in. One of Petticolas's friends would say, quote, "To be dismounted as infantry will not agree with the Texas boys, as they have never been accustomed to walking. Now, 1,000 miles from home, afoot and without a dog, and in as dreary a country as this, and things in such a state of confusion, our prospect is but a gloomy one." End quote. The future march on foot towards Albuquerque would take a harsh toll on the once mounted infantry and their feet. I will spare y'all the stories of maggots, lice, pustules, and blisters that the poor soldiers wrote about on their long march northward. Just know, it was rough and cold and long, and there would be many more marches to come. The other hard decision for Sibley to make was whether to actually press onward to the north or to rest up and re-attack Fort Craig to the south. But on the last day of February 1862, Sibley decided that the only course of action was to continue north, thereby cutting off communication with the Confederate capital in Arizona and the soon-to-be Governor Steele. Davidson would write in his journal of this fateful decision. I had supposed that we would return and capture Fort Craig and Canby's army there before we attempted to proceed up the Rio Grande. It never occurred to me that we would deliberately place ourselves between two armies, sever ourselves from the base of our operations, and cut ourselves off from all hope of assistance from home. Yet, this is exactly what we did." End quote. It would not be an easy procession north. Sibley sent a group of 2nd Texas Mounted Rifles under Pyron up ahead to Albuquerque to secure it for the Confederates, and they would arrive to the old city on March 2nd, just in time to see the burning flames of the government warehouses. At that time, the city was held by Union officer Captain Herbert M. Enos, who that morning had sent woodcutters into the Manzano Mountains to bring back some firewood. Once up on them slopes, though, they saw the column of rebels approaching the town about 20 miles south. They quickly sent a runner down the mountain who told Captain Enos, who immediately gave the order to gather everything at the storehouse and to burn it, but also to burn the corrals and barns as well. So by the time the Confederates got there, the center of Union command was on fire, and the Federals had fled mere moments before. Fraser writes of this quote, "As fire consumed the stores of tallow and pickled pork, a huge pool of melted grease flowed out of the commissary building and into the street." Now quoting Artillery Lieutenant Fulcred, "There was a great quantity stores that were at that place and thereby have passed the command through the winter. It looked like a sin to destroy the necessaries of life in such a manner." He would continue, quote, "When I saw this, I thought of Napoleon and Moscow." End quote. Regardless of the setback, Pyron and Fulcred and the men would take possession of the city from Southern sympathizers, raise the Confederate flag in the main plaza, and sing Dixie. They then took up quarters around the plaza and waited for the rest of Sibley's brigade. The rest of the men slowly marched up the Rio Grande towards Albuquerque while succumbing to more diseases and dwindling rations. The 4th Mounted Infantry of Texas had it the worst since they no longer had their horses. They were not accustomed to walking so much, and it drained them. The weather also turned more harsh the farther north they went, and then blowing winds with sand blew out what fires they could light. Firewood along this route, and in much of New Mexico, outside of the mountains, it was in short supply. Fraser writes, quote, "Desperate for sustenance, the army foraged among the natives, wreaking economic ruin on the tiny villages of Baylor, Pajarito, Valencia, Peralta, La Jolla, Sabinal, Lemitar, Bosque, Polvadera, Los Lunes, Los Chaves, Las Nutrias, and Los Lentes. Soldiers confiscated livestock, household goods, saddles and tack, cooking utensils, and even roof poles and house frames." Quote, "We had to force the alcalde to furnish wood," Smith wrote. "There is no grass or wood in this country." End quote. Foraging parties scoured the land, with some success. End all quotes. And this would come back to bite them in a couple of months. Petticolas would write in his journal, quote, "We are now beginning to experience about the greatest of the manifold hardships of war. Upon the battlefield, there was the fierce din of conflict and the danger to face. But we had our courage and convictions of the importance of winning the day to sustain us. But to trudge along day after day with nothing to eat save beans, to go from early breakfast till late supper and feel the weakness and gnawing of hunger, is a feature of soldiering without any redeeming trait." End quote. Petticolus's friend Hannah would write, quote, "We are now entirely out of everything in the way of provisions and yet 30 miles to Albuquerque, our promised paradise." End quote. It got so bad at times that some of the men secretly planned around their small fires some form of mutiny. One, Private William Henry Smith, wrote that, quote, "The field officers are drunk all the time, unfit for duty, incompetent to attend their duty," end quote. Dirty Shirt Scurry, the future hero of Glorietta, he tried to resign his commission multiple times. The fourth was in tatters. Sibley's soldiers, animals, and his war seemed to be falling apart. All the while, the Federals were riding all over the countryside telling the locals to hide their food, flee their homes, and take their livestock with them. To counter their hunger and boredom, the rebels eventually began organizing foraging corps to look for animals, food, anything to burn, anything they could use at all. This actually would lead to shootouts with the small groups of Federals following them, although rarely did they end in harm to either group. But surprisingly, and much to the rebels' relief, as they approached Albuquerque, the locals became more and more friendly, and many welcomed the Confederates as liberators. One local Hispanic, Petticolas wrote, showed him his bayonet wound that he had received from a Federal recruiter who stabbed the man when he refused to join the Union volunteers. By March 7th, the rest of the Texas Army finally arrived in Albuquerque, and their luck began to change. Over the next few days, the rebels would come across 50 wagons full of food and supplies that would last the small army 40 days. One of the caches was from the west, where the goods had been stored for a planned, but ultimately abandoned, operation against the Navajos before the war had started. The other load of wagons came from my mountains, the Manzano Sandias. It was a supply train headed for Fort Craig. They probably captured it in the pass not far from my home. But also, although the Federals had burned the storehouse in the town, the local residents had saved nearly half the foodstuffs before the flames got to them. The rebels were given much of it, but they also confiscated a good portion of the rest. Once in town, Sibley began reorganizing his army as wealthy Confederate sympathizers in the city turned over around $200,000 worth of gold and goods to the army. Frazier writes, quote, "Rations, molasses, flour, mutton, and beef revived the soldiers and their spirits. With his army back in shape, the general renewed his call for all New Mexicans to abandon the Union cause, promising complete amnesty for those who had fought the Confederacy." End quote. Unfortunately, during the hike to Albuquerque, though, many of the wounded and sick Confederate soldiers were left in Socorro at the hospital they had set up there, a hospital which was soon overran by Yankees. While not exactly prisoners of war, these wounded and slowly recovering rebels were now surrounded by enemy soldiers who were, quote, "drunk and talking rather too glib," end quote. One of the rebels would write that if the Yankees kept it up, he was afraid, quote, "one of our boys will tip some of them off their pins," end quote. In other words, turn to violence. Eventually, 2 wagons loaded with food were sent down by Sibley to the wounded and starving men at Socorro, and the Union commanders that were there stationed allowed the rebels to be fed. Which sounds like such a strange situation, really. But this isn't the only time that will happen. From Albuquerque, Sibley devised a 3-pronged plan for taking northern New Mexico and ultimately attacking Fort Union, which was the last bastion of Yankee strength in the territory, if you don't count the surrounded Fort Craig. To begin with, Sibley sent the bulk of his army, 14 companies, into the Sandia-Manzano Mountains, where they could hide in the many canyons and valleys. Canyons like Tijeras. In the mountains were plenty of trees for fires and grass to sustain their animals. There is also plenty of game like deer and rabbits. Also, I will have you know there are bears and mountain lions. Just a few weeks ago, after a prescribed burn in the national forest across from our land, a lion was seen on my neighbor's trail cam walking through their yard. After I learned that, I began again to wear my firearm when taking the dog for a walk. But these lions and bears were no bother for the rebels who were ready to continue their campaign of expanding the Confederate Empire westward. These men were tasked with blocking the road to Albuquerque from the east and eventually to move up the ancient Galisteo Basin towards the base of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Once there, they would start walking the trail of modern-day I-25 towards Fort Union. That would be the Santa Fe Trail. And Fort Union is about 30 miles north of Las Vegas, New Mexico, the other Las Vegas. At the same time, another column, this one on horseback, and mostly made up of Major Charles Pyron's Arizonans and Texans, they would head straight north from Albuquerque to take the New Mexican capital of Santa Fe. Not far behind Major Pyron would be 4 companies of the 5th Texas Mounted, led by Major John Shropshire. They would stay behind and rest in Albuquerque just for a bit before heading north towards the capital as well. His final prong, Sibley, of the 3-prong attack, would be led by Colonel Tom Green, who would also rest a moment at Albuquerque before also going through the Sandias and over the eastern portion of the Sangre de Cristos beyond the all-important Glorieta Pass. All 3 of these groups would eventually meet up and head north towards Fort Union, where Sibley planned to assault the last major bastion of federal strength in the territory, thus finally winning New Mexico and Arizona for the Confederacy. Only after taking Fort Union and driving out the Yankees could the South then secure Southern California and possibly even Colorado. And think of all the mines and gold there. It is honestly unknown what Sibley's plans were after this assault. Some say he would go north and take Denver, while Steele in the South would go towards California. But others have recorded that after taking Fort Union, Sibley had actually planned on then marching his forces east through Kansas towards Missouri with the ultimate goal of securing those border states for the Confederacy. Regardless of his plans, the coming battle would turn the tide in the West against the Confederacy for good. Union Captain Gurdon Chapin, Assistant Adjutant General on Colonel Edward R.S. Canby's staff, he was at Fort Union. He had been getting his reports of the incoming rebel force, and he began to panic. It seemed no one in Washington cared what was happening in the West. And if they didn't act, the rebels' dreams of empire would no doubt be realized. After the Battle of Valverde and the cutting off of Canby from the rest of the Federals, Captain Chapin began riding to the east in the hopes of receiving some sort of aid and to hammer home the necessity of winning this theater. He wrote, quote, "Our loss is great. The enemy is now above Colonel Canby on the Rio Grande and of course has cut him off from all communications with his supplies. It is needless to say that this country is in a critical condition. The militia have all run away and the New Mexico volunteers are deserting in large numbers. No dependence whatever can be placed on the natives. They are worse than worthless. They are really aides to the enemy who catch them, take their arms, and tell them to go home." He continues, "We must look to the future. The conquest of New Mexico is a great political feature of the rebellion. It will gain the rebels a name and a prestige over Europe and operate against the Union cause. These Texans will not rest with the forces they have already with them, but they will have large additions to their command here in order to extend their conquest toward Old Mexico and in the direction of Southern California." End quote. He begged further for more troops and more cannons, and he said that, quote, "These reinforcing troops cannot serve the government better than by saving this territory. I have given you a true picture of the state of this country, and if you wish to save it, you, I hope and pray, will act immediately." End quote. By early March of 1862, only a few hundred Federals held Fort Union, and less than 100 troops held Santa Fe. Fort Union could not fall, for if it did, the Union would lose the territory. At Fort Union was one colonel of volunteers, Gabriel Rene Paul, and with he and his men rests the future of the war in the West. But thankfully for Colonel Paul and the Yankees in northern New Mexico, 900 more volunteers from Colorado, men nicknamed the Pikes Peakers, had left Colorado at the end of February, and they were, at that moment, marching towards Fort Union in a miraculously rapid fashion. These men were mountain men proper, with long beards and longer hair. The falling snow didn't bother them, and the prospect of battle excited them. Over in Santa Fe, Major Donaldson of the Union, on March 3rd, gave the order to his federal troops to begin loading everything of value into wagons and to burn the rest of it, just as they had done in Albuquerque. But just like in that old town to the south, the local residents, what few remained, which was only about half of the population by March. But after the major ordered the storehouses burned, the local residents extinguished the fires and looted what they could for themselves. There was no reason to waste in this harsh land, they thought. By the end of that day, the 3rd of March, all Union soldiers had abandoned the capital and were heading east towards Fort Union. Major Donaldson and his troops would arrive near the fort by March 7th, where he would establish the town of Las Vegas as the new seat of the New Mexican Yankee government. But much to the surprise of Donaldson's men and Colonel Paul, the major had no orders beyond moving to Las Vegas and Fort Union. He had not heard from Canby, obviously, so he was left out in the cold. One Santa Fe resident who had accompanied the soldiers east to Union from Santa Fe, a man named John Clark, he was bewildered at this lack of direction, and he would write, quote, "I am beginning to think that military men do not, after all, monopolize all the wisdom in the world. The management of affairs in this department for the past 6 months has been a blunder from beginning to end, beginning with the imbecility and treason of Lind and continuing up to the present time." End quote. A few days after Donaldson had arrived at Fort Union on March 11th, those Pikes Peakers, the 1st Colorado, arrived, all 900 of them, and they arrived as welcome reinforcements for the Yankees. They'd had an arduous journey through piling snow and blowing winds, practically a mountain hurricane, really, and as they crossed the modern-day border of New Mexico, near a place called Raton Pass in the Sangre de Cristos, they'd gotten word of the incoming Texans. So the men dropped everything they were carrying except for their arms and ammo and 2 blankets a man, and they hurried the last 100 miles south in less than 2 days. Sibley, from his luxurious home in Albuquerque, a home that had been given to him by the 2 prominent men, the same ones that gave him over $200,000. These men were the Otero brothers, but Sibley in Albuquerque ordered his men out into the field for this final assault. The men in the Sandias, despite having plenty of natural foraging opportunities, were immediately plagued with a sandstorm that whipped through the pass and covered the men as they marched higher in elevation. And let me tell you, the wind here can blow at 60 miles per hour through the pass. After a good windstorm, I have the pleasure, always, of picking up roof shingles all over my 2 acres. Sometimes the wind's so strong it picks up the roof and slams it back down, and I wish I were kidding. Not like the whole thing, but a part of it. As soon as the men were out of the biting wind, they encountered snow, and lots of it. I'm at 6,800 feet at the top of the pass, and there is plenty of snow that falls here, much to my wife and I's surprise. She left Wisconsin to escape the cold, but we found a little bit of it here. We got 2 feet in 3 days just a few weeks ago in early November 2024. Granted, it was melted by Monday, but still. These Confederate Southern men would wake up shivering, and they'd be forced to scoop mounds of the stuff off their hats and shake their blankets loose of the cold snow. The men down in the valley, near Albuquerque, they didn't have it much better either. One private wrote, quote, "The whole face of the earth was covered with snow. It is severe upon our soldiers without any tent or anything to shelter from the snow." End quote. The troops had to abandon most of their camping equipment weeks before after Valverde, since they had no animals to haul their stuff. They were moving with the bare minimum. Again, this was a plague for the South the entire campaign throughout New Mexico. Then, for all the men near the Sandias in Albuquerque, once the snow melted, everything turned to mud. It was a tough existence, but the men soldiered on. In the mountains, many of them hid out in caves or in the homes of the local residents. They made the most of the cold by dancing and singing and playing cards, and many of them read novels and magazines. They were slowly recuperating from the long march from the south. That is until diseases and coughing began to set in, and then boredom. These 3 armies that Sibley sent should have kept moving. Sibley should have pressed his advantage, and the men in charge knew this. 4 company commanders resigned during this lull. The men began to be bewildered by the lack of movement, and Sibley and his command in Albuquerque were all the while drunk. In a few episodes, I'll even quote one of the men who says that Sibley and the officers were drowning in rum and whiskey. Up in Santa Fe, Major Pyron and his men waltzed into the city without conflict on March 10th. They then occupied the palace of the governors and the nearby La Fonda Hotel. They then raised the rebel flag in the square. They'd had to cut down a tree and build a makeshift flagpole since the Federals had torn down the original and then burned it. Megan Kate Nelson writes of this occupation of Santa Fe, quote, "When they raised the Confederate flag above the Union Army's former headquarters in New Mexico, they became the first and only Confederate Army to occupy a capital city during the American Civil War." End quote. But the lack of provisions in Santa Fe and the cool welcome by the locals meant they couldn't stay in the very old city for long. They, as conquerors, faced the same problems the previous conquering Spanish had faced all those hundreds of years before them. They had little water, little food, and it was cold and at a high elevation. On March 22nd, Major Shropshire and his men joined Pyron in Santa Fe. And then, only 3 days later, on the 25th, Pyron and Shrop learned of the arrival of the Coloradans and got word that the Yankees were probing westward on the Santa Fe Trail. With that news, the Confederates left Santa Fe and began heading east under the Sangre de Cristos towards Fort Union. But as Nelson writes, quote, "They would need to be vigilant during their march through Apache Canyon, which was just 15 miles from Santa Fe. There, the trail wound through rocky terrain, edged by steep slopes covered with stunted pines and cedars. The soils were light and shallow, and eroded easily during the thunderstorms. Parts of the trail were cut through with deep ravines and gullies. Apache Canyon was, as one traveler through the region put it, quote, one of those grim and dangerous passes common in New Mexico." End all quotes. A few days before the rebels left Santa Fe, on March 21st, Dirty Shirt Scurry and his men in the Sandia Mountains, tired of the lull and pause, began their trek towards Galisteo. And thankfully for us, Petty Colas would write in his journal about the march. He wrote, quote, "The mountain scenery and places is picturesque and interesting, but an air of desolate lonesomeness reigns over the whole country." End quote. He could not be more right. The highway through Galisteo Basin, today's Highway 41, is a beautiful and a lonely drive. While heading north, the Sangre de Cristo Mountains loom with snow-capped peaks and clouds always nearby. To the east are the open plains that seem to extend forever. And to the west is South Mountain, the Ortiz Mountains, and a volcanic feature known as the Wave. A traveler will descend into the basin and pass through Comanche Pass, which has tens of thousands of ancient and recent petroglyphs. There are also tons of abandoned ancestral Puebloan ruins littered with potsherds and artifacts. Today, the largest and most ominous residence in New Mexico, sits atop a cliff's edge and overlooks the entire landscape. That house once belonged to a certain Mossad agent who did not kill himself. I have actually walked in the ruins of Casablanca among rattlesnakes and eroded room blocks in this very basin. I was in awe at this site of the largest Avanu carving in the Southwest, which I saw when I visited not long ago on a private tour through the private ranches that dot the desolate landscape. The men didn't record any ancient dwellings in their journals, but they did enjoy the open pits and mines that have been bringing out gold and turquoise for almost 2,000 years. The rebels made a leisurely 4-day walk through the Galisteo Basin, and all the while, they had no idea Union patrols were readying for a battle only 20 miles north. In a tight and rocky canyon in the mountain, known as Apache Pass, which I just described, a place that lays west of Glorieta Pass, which is the site of the last major battle in New Mexico during the Civil War between the Yankees and the Confederates. In the next episode, I will cover at length the decisive battle in the Southwest known as Glorieta Pass. Thank y'all for listening, and I'll see you again soon in the American Southwest. This episode is graciously sponsored by one of my new favorite companies, the Buffalo Wool Co. Y'all know I have great love and respect for America's national mammal, the bison. My very first episode was over the wild and woolly beast, so when I tell you I discovered a company that makes 100% bison wool products 100% in America, you know how excited I got. The Buffalo Wool Co. makes the most incredible and comfortable socks you've ever worn. Not only are the Buffalo Wool Co. socks comfortable, but they are warm. You can wear them in the house, to bed, or on a hike. I wore mine in the sands of Great Sand Dunes National Park, and I've worn my Buffalo Wool Co. socks while hunting in the northern forests of Wisconsin. I plan on wearing them for the rest of my life. Buffalo Wool Co. 100% guarantees you will love the product or your money back. The owners of Buffalo Wool Co. have been raising bison in North Texas for almost 30 years, and they're even more passionate about the amazing animals than I am. Buffalo Wool Co. not only makes socks, but also knit caps, gloves, scarves, and extremely warm and comfortable clothing for kids. My wife and I have a little one on the way, and I will absolutely be keeping our kids snug and warm with the Buffalo Wool Co.'s expanding brand. If you like being comfortable and warm and looking awesome while doing it, and if you support 100% Made in America clothing by people who are passionate about these animals and the ranchers who raise them, you will love the Buffalo Wool Co. Head over to their website, thebuffalowoolco.com, or my website, theamericansouthwest.com, where there will be a link on the home page. That's thebuffalowoolco.com.